We talk a lot about Next.js on this channel, how to use it, how it works, all the things you can do with it. But what we haven't talked about is why. Specifically, why do I use Next? How did I get here in the first place? What made me such a huge fanboy of Next and Vercel? This video is explicitly not sponsored by Vercel. I have a couple other sponsored videos with them coming up. They have no idea I'm making this one. I'll be honest, I didn't either until just now. I'm filming this live on the fly because we were talking about it. I realized it was an interesting topic because my history with Vercel is nothing like people seem to think. It goes back quite a bit. In fact, all the way back to 2017 when I first started using Elixir at Twitch. When I joined at Twitch, I was, I guess, a Python dev at best, but honestly, I wasn't much of a dev at all. I had written a bunch of plugins in Java for my Minecraft servers. I somehow just barely managed to pass my data structures class in C++. And I was working on some things in Python for the research projects I was contributing to. I even had been working on iOS apps and specifically Apple Watch apps a bit at the time, which were a mess of Objective-C and a tiny bit of Swift. But honestly, I didn't really feel at home with any specific language and barely even considered myself a programmer. I only got into Twitch because the person who ran the team had the same music taste as me and decided to offer me a 3-month contract despite not being qualified at all. 6 months later, yes, I got my contract extended because I wasn't doing well enough. But at the 6-month mark, I was doing well enough, they decided to keep me full-time. And that team I had randomly joined, this new team that formed, was using Elixir despite the rest of the company using Ruby and a little bit of Go. I did not know what I was getting into when I tried Elixir, which was my first real functional programming language. And I fell in love fast. It went from, oh, this is weird, to wow, I love code now. So fast. So fast that when a year later the team folded and I had to go write in Golang, I hated it. I hated it so much. I had fallen so deeply in love with functional programming that the thought of not doing that hurt. It hurt so much that I just wasn't productive. I was so unhappy that my manager pulled me aside to subtly let me know that I would have an issue if I didn't pick up my performance, but also because he noticed how unhappy I was and that I wasn't enjoying my work. He didn't mince words. He made it very clear to me that I was not performing to the expected bar, but also that he didn't think it was because of my lack of engineering capabilities, just my lack of content using the tech I was using. He pushed me to contribute to the rewrite of the Twitch site, moving us from Ember to React. And I fell in love fast. I did not expect to. I was known as like the front-end hater guy. I was shipping live view in 2017 with Elixir and Phoenix because I hated writing JavaScript that much. I was probably one of the first production users of live view at the time. When I started using React and I started playing with the composition, seeing how powerful the component model was, I fell in love fast. I fell in love so fast that to this day, I'm largely stereotyped as a front-end engineer, which is really funny to me because I was a backend for the vast majority of my career. And even today, I'm spending more of my time thinking about servers than clients, although the relationship between them is something I spend a lot of time on too. So that's my history of how I got into React. How do we end up here? Well, after years of contributing at Twitch, be it the internal tools like the one we had for the safety stuff, as well as the public-facing Twitch site, I got to learn a lot about best practices for building and scaling complex front-end applications. One of the things I learned is the importance of the API layer that the front end is working with. Since I had been backend first and then I moved to front end, I was actually in a really good position to talk with the backend teams to make things come together. I spent most of my time talking with the teams running the backend and the GraphQL stuff that we were actually communicating with and using in our services. In order to make sure our stuff shipped and worked as we expected, that synchronization was essential and ended up being a huge portion of my time spent. And honestly, I love GraphQL for this because it gave us a contract to put in the middle between the backend and the front end. And once we agreed on it, we could all go our separate ways and work and then eventually come back together to make sure it all combines correctly. And if it doesn't, somebody got fired, which was awesome. Okay, we should have fired more people at that point, but you get what I'm trying to say. It was really cool having a solution that let us as backend and front end agree on something and then go do our thing. The harsh reality was if the front end needed something and backend was too busy to do it, either you did it yourself, which ended up being a ton of work, especially if you weren't working in that code base regularly, or you politely asked and waited until hopefully someone bothered to ship the thing. That back and forth ended up being so much of the thing holding up shipping for us that it frustrated me to no end. I got so tired of waiting in these back and forths that I ended up doing a lot of the back end work myself and then getting blocked in code review, and yeah, it was a mess. Things that should have taken a few hours to do ended up taking days, if not weeks, not because the process is slow or because big companies work that way, simply because synchronizing the backend and the front end properly across teams, across technologies, across code bases was a difficult problem. Eventually, I left Twitch to join a startup. I joined the startup, I took over client fully, and I was really excited to build the mobile app and the web app. Specifically, I was excited to not be blocked constantly and being able to ship updates whenever we had them so our users could have a great experience no matter what issues they ran into. And that's why I picked Expo and React Native so we could ship stuff really fast to mobile. But web, I didn't really have a go-to solution yet. I was using Netlify for my own personal stuff, but I was having a few issues getting it to deploy. Specifically, I was using Snowpack, not Webpack, for the faster build times, and it was not doing great with Netlify at the moment. Eventually, I got it working, but I've been hearing more and more about this Vercel thing. What pushed me over the edge was very specific. This backend team that used to be the front end team that didn't like me too much was taking forever to ship stuff. I would request a change. I would wait 12 hours for them to wake up. They'd reply saying, oh no, it works fine the way it is. Look at our example. I would wake up, go check the example. It didn't work. I would tell them that. Wait another 12 hours, to which they reply, it totally works. You're just holding it wrong. And never once did it actually work the way they specified. So I was constantly blocked by these guys. We had a few random things that we needed that they kept saying were going to take days, if not weeks to build, that I knew shouldn't take that long. So I needed a way to run a little bit of server-side code that wouldn't get into their repo, because as soon as it touched their GitHub, I had no ability to ship. Anything that involved this team blocked me immensely. So eventually, I convinced the CEO to let me spin up little small endpoints that weren't stateful, which meant he said that they weren't backend. His definition of backend was fully stateful, including the database running constantly. But I convinced him that I could run these one-off functions somewhere just to fetch some data from a backend API and fix it for me. And eventually he caved and said, sure. So I started hunting. And when I started hunting, I discovered something really cool. And no, it wasn't Next. A really cool thing I discovered was Vercel functions. They've had a lot of different names over the time, but when I was using this in 2021, they were still called the API directory. No, this didn't mean the API directory in Next. It meant that you could just have a folder named API in your repo, export a function, and now it's an endpoint. Whatever you export here can now be used by Vercel to handle get, post, put, whatever. And when I realized I don't have to change my framework, I don't have to change anything, I can literally just make this folder in my front-end project named API, put a file in it, hello.ts, and just do something there. I was like, oh shit, this is an obvious solution. So I made the move over, and that move was awesome. Having access to full backend runtimes, without having to think about the scaling or any of those things, made it a very obvious choice for me. So funny enough, whether or not you believe it, I was using Vercel years before I had ever touched Next, because I was still super Snowpack pilled, eventually moved it over to Vite, but I kept my front end and my backend separate still. I just liked the idea of them being in the same code base so I could make changes at once and have everything synchronized properly. And having the ability to just add backend functionality to my front-end repo by adding one little file in the API directory was magic. And if I go back to our old code, APIs added. Let's take a look at this. Here's the code where I was handling all my auth in my API helpers folder. I was still using worker KV for all of my storage. And it was a mess. I hard-coded the key just to get it working. Add user to room, call off. You'll see I have all these API functions for the different things. So get allowed user, handle request. This was before they had the get, post, put, all of that. This was just request response, which were Vercel, but they were pretty standard request response from the Express request response. But in here, handle request, room names with a query, make sure that it's a string, throw, we lowercase it, get the value from KV. If no perms, we send a 403. Otherwise, we actually send you the content. I'm almost positive that worker KV instance is dead, and if not, I'll go kill it right after. But yeah. So, as you see here, pretty boring old Vite code. I even added a port call because this is actually one of the annoying parts, is in order to run this locally, I had to have the API run through the Vercel CLI. And the Vercel CLI is overall pretty good. I honestly don't use it that much. But for this, it was nice because I could run these API directory things locally and have Vite running locally too. The issue was Vite kept getting its requests eaten by the Vercel runner, which was obnoxious. I actually have my blog. Part of why I made my blog originally was to bitch about this, using Vite on Vercel, because I went to hell and back to fix weird things around query params that were being eaten because Vite doesn't format them correctly and shit like that. And I wrote a whole guide on how to make this all come together so you could have your API directory work with Vite in local dev. It was annoying, but I made it all work. But then I ran into another unexpected issue. When you put all of your routes in the API directory as individual files like this, in order for them to compile and run safely, each one gets compiled and deployed by itself. So first off, I was hitting limits of how many of those I could have. And second off, every new endpoint added 40 to 50 seconds of build time and deploy time, which was entirely going against the thing I was trying to do, which is make it as fast as possible to make changes and fix things. So even though this code base was awesome, I had my super client heavy stuff and I had my super server heavy stuff. We could even browse through the files and I'll show you that it was a pretty boring Vite app where I had my React query client provider, which I was using for just fetching data. I had my boring old pages, which were settings, home, and call. And call mostly was doing client-side stuff because this was an app for doing video calls. So obviously this one's going to be very client heavy. I had all the different states. If not in call, return the join. If params channel, return call not found. If it's loading, return loading. If no token, on off. And then I actually render the video call. But these types of things were pretty client heavy, so I didn't see a need to use a server-side framework. Why would I ever need Next.js for my video call app? The reason I needed it was because of those build times and the way it was deploying. Since all of those different endpoints had become their own lambdas, my build times at this point were horrible. I wonder if I can see easily here. I don't think that it has the history for it, but my build times doing this had gotten to 5 to 6 minutes, when before they were 20 to 30 seconds. So I wanted a way to easily bundle all of this into one endpoint. And after doing a little bit of research, I learned that Next.js just does that for you. When we were in the docs before with the Vercel functions, you'll see there is the Next app, Next pages, and other frameworks. I was doing the other framework solution, which, by the way, also works with other languages. I don't know if it says that here, but there are, you can use Go, Python, Ruby, or Edge runtimes. And there's ways to use PHP and shit on this too, which is actually really cool. You can deploy any of those through Vercel just by putting it in the API directory. So these docs got killed for the old version that I was using, but I bet I can even find the PR where I did this. This is the PR where I actually moved us over to Next.js. I gutted our routing. I moved over to file-based everything. I deleted all of these API helpers because I could move all of these to the API directory in Next. I didn't have to change too much. I got to delete a decent bit of code, but the win here was that all of these source pages things got bundled at once instead of being bundled independently. And if I go look at the code base at this point in time, this ended up being a pretty basic app. We had our API directory that had all of the APIs in it. And rather than each of these having its own build process and going out to its own Lambda, all of these things got bundled into a single endpoint that was hosted on one Lambda by Vercel. So my build times went from 5 to 6 minutes down to 2. And the performance was a lot better too, because the endpoints were more likely to be warm since all of them were running out of the same Lambda. So this ended up being a massive win for performance, even if the developer experience was slightly slower because it had to use Webpack, which I had been Webpack free for years at that point. So my desire for the Next API directory was so great that I was willing to do things I didn't like, such as use Webpack and deal with their data fetching stuff. And God, did I hate Vercel's data fetching. Get server-side props quickly became the bane of my existence. I hated this so much, it's hard to put into words. It just did not make any sense. So much so that I wrote my second ever real blog post, which was an inconsistent truth, Next and type safety. Because get server-side props was not type safe. It was not a good client experience. It was barely even a functional server experience. I have a lot of videos now where I complain all about get server-side props and how awful it was. The honest truth is that most of Next was stuff that I hated. The things that made Next different from Vite or from other solutions just pissed me off to no end. I actually didn't like Next at all. What I did like was its ability to co-locate my backend code and my front-end code in one project in a meaningful way where the server and the client are much more closely tied, even if the methods that they had provided for sharing things between the two were things that I hated. And believe me, I hated all of those things to the point where, honestly, more often than not, I was just calling React query everywhere. So if we find any of the actual code, which would be in source components, you'll see here, I just have a bunch of use query calls where I am fetching things from my server, and I just do /API now because I know where it's going to be, which is nice. And I have a bunch of these use query calls all over the code base where I'm doing a bunch of parsing and making sure the data is the right format and shit. But it was still better than server-side stuff because get server-side props didn't really give me the stuff I needed for most of the pages, especially because it had to be really dynamic, so it was for video calls. Next only gave you a solution for when the page first rendered. From that point forward, it was your problem. And I hated that. So I used almost none of Next's server-side stuff for React. I used the API directory to host APIs, but then I made another important change. In September of 2021, I moved us to tRPC, which let me delete quite a bit of code and made maintaining all of this hilariously simpler. Yes, this is when I actually got tRPC pilled. I played with it quickly for this project and almost instantly fell in love and realized I needed to be using it for everything. Here's my Agora router. Agora was the solution we were using for our WebRTC at the time, and it was way simpler. I have my router, which has my auth context. I have a query, which has get token. I have my input, which is a room slug, which is now validated. This is all validated here, so I could delete all the validation code. Then I have my resolver, which returns null if you don't have a session, and then it returns the Agora auth token if you do. Same deal for getting the embed token. All of this code became hilariously simple to write, and then actually using it was even simpler. tRPC.use query, give it the string, give it the values, and it's all not just working, but type safe. I was able to make shit so much simpler. If we look for the use call token code I deleted, see how much longer these endpoints were with all of the checks, making sure it's a post, making sure that we have the right data, getting the session, making sure we have a user ID, getting their profile, making sure we have the right data, and then finally doing the thing we were here to do. This went from 41 lines of code to like 5, and consuming it was so much easier too, like hilariously so. And I was able to delete all of these giant endpoints in favor of things that are way easier to work with. Oh, here's the call token code. So this 33 line get call token, I could just delete entirely. Where is the actual use for it though? Okay, I can't find where I deleted the call token code, but I'm sure it's in there somewhere. Regardless, you get the point. I was not using Next the way you probably think of Next.js, because I wasn't using Next, the server and client all-in-one solution. In fact, I was barely using Next beyond the bundler. I found it as a really convenient way to put my React client code and my whatever else server code in the same project all at once. And as we all know from the original T3 stack, it was actually a good experience. I had massively advocated for this idea of using Next as a way to make a good client and a good server that are close, but not tied, and using things like tRPC to do that gluing part together. At this point, I was really liking my experience with Next and Vercel. Even if I wasn't using Next, I had gone all in on Vercel and the way it let me build and deploy my solutions. So much so that some of my coworkers from both Ping and other startups, like Rose here, call it out to this day. Because I was far from YouTube. This was years before I had started YouTube. I was just trying to build as effectively as possible. And Rose ended up being one of the first people I converted to using Vercel. It was weird because now there's literally probably hundreds of thousands of y'all. But at the time, I didn't have influence. I had like 50 followers on Twitter and a few nerdy friends. So I just talked about this with them, and they fell in love too. And I love Rose for calling this out here because, yeah, I was obsessed. Once I realized how much easier all of these things could be after spending a decade suffering through all of these parts, the ability to link a project from GitHub that would serve all of my APIs and all of my clients the best possible version of my experience by clicking 2 buttons to link my GitHub to my Vercel project was magic. And I fell in love. I sounded a lot like a shill because it was unlike anything I'd experienced before. But it was genuine. As Rose says here, I actually really fucking love this stuff. So much so that when I got into Y Combinator, I was just seeking people to nerd out about this with, and I couldn't find them. I was desperately looking for people who wanted to talk about these things with me because I just was such a nerd. So that's why I did the video that many of y'all have probably seen, the roundest video. This is the video. This was my first dev video. And it also wasn't a video. It was me doing a quick live stream because I was building tools for creators and I wanted to better understand what they needed. And I'd been talking to a few people on Twitter who I wanted to explain my stack to that didn't seem to get it. So I made this to showcase why I like this tech so much. I posted it on YouTube, didn't really do much. But then I got lucky enough to have Dan Abramov come on for a mock interview, which did really well, and eventually got this to kick up too, to the point where both of these videos ended up being pretty close in terms of viewership long term, which is kind of crazy to think that a brand new YouTuber was able to get as many views on his building a video app live as he was interviewing Dan Abramov. Just mind-blowing. The reason I was able to have Dan on is I care a lot about how job interviews work. So when he said on Twitter he was going to be doing some mock job interviews with YouTubers, if anyone was down to hit him up, I obviously immediately hit him up. He was down. I got to do that. It was one of the first pieces of content using Ping because I had to have him call in. Really proud of that. Really proud of that interview. Yeah, these were the first 2 ever. I learned so much from doing that. More importantly, I got hooked on having these deep technical conversations and sharing the magic of how these tools were coming together. The beauty of combining Next as like a bundler, effectively, with React, a wonderful client-side framework, with tRPC, the best way at the time to connect your server and your client together, and Prisma, which was honestly kind of magical at the time because there was no good TypeScript ORM that had that level of type safety built in. PlanetScale, which broke my brain at the time. Oh, PlanetScale was so cool. And Tailwind, because I finally liked styling. Having all of this come together in a way that felt that good was magical. And even 2 years later, I almost missed that moment. But the magic wasn't something only I was feeling, because T3 Stack took off. There were points where Create T3 app, which was made by Nexel, a fan of mine soon after all of this, Create T3 app was getting more invocations than Remix, which is crazy when you think about it, that a YouTuber's fans built a boilerplate using their recommended technologies that became the third most popular framework for React. But that's how cool this stuff was to use. And funny enough, as I've been hinting at this whole time, most of it was built around avoiding Next to the best of your ability. Next was the box that this all went in, but we had basically dumped the box out, shook everything out of it, put back like 2 parts, and then filled the rest with other things. And it was awesome. It was so awesome that I was starting to talk to Vercel themselves and the people who worked on Next, which was mind-blowing because I was just a fan at the time. All of a sudden, I get to actually talk about and work with these people. And then the channel blew up, like really quickly. I only started posting videos for real in April of 2022. I had done like 1 or 2 before then, but it wasn't something I was taking very seriously. And then I started doing videos with Prime, then I started posting more often, and it blew up fast, and I was blown away. And I realized quickly we had to change how the channel ran, because I had to have an editor helping, I had to have others helping me research topics and manage the channel, and I also had to run my company. So expenses were going up and my time was going down. I also had my first ever company reach out to talk about a potential sponsor, which was Upstash. I also realized at the time I need Upstash for a bunch of stuff. So I tried it, I loved it, especially the rate limiter, and I did my first ever sponsor deal, which was a huge, huge deal for me. The idea of making money off of YouTube was just mind-blowing. At this point, I realized that sponsors were a thing I could do, and as long as I picked ones that built things I trusted, this was a really good opportunity. So I reached out to all the companies I was shipping in production, including PlanetScale, including Axiom, including Vercel, and they were all down. So I ended up, for the first time ever, having a set of sponsors making this content possible. Not too long after that, Vercel announces the app router and server components. And my mind is blown. Initially, I'm actually quite skeptical. You could find my old videos where I first talk about Next.js and server components. And my response is, I'm not sure. But then they made one really big change that entirely shifted my tone. They made server components async, like properly async. Like you could just await a call. There's even a clip from one of my old videos where I say they should have done this.
So this is the future I dream of. And this can absolutely happen. But the point I wanted to make here is I dream of a world where for server components, you can define a component async, do whatever in here, and return.
Yeah, I was skeptical, but then they changed it to be async, and I decided to play. And boy, oh boy, did I fall in love. Remember how before I said that I basically dumped out all of Next in favor of my own solutions? I had been leapfrogged. Many of the things I was putting my time and effort into suddenly felt both archaic and worse to use as a user. When I saw how powerful it was just awaiting some data inside of your components, I knew it was going to be magical, not because I just saw it and it was obvious, but because I had put a bunch of time into Astro as well. And the magic of just awaiting some data and having it type safe to just use in your markup without having to make an API endpoint or handle the types between the backend and the front end, and all of this chaos just vanished. And I realized this was the ultimate version of what I'd been seeking this whole time, where V0 was endpoints in some other code base, client code has to guess what data it's going to be getting, to V1 of now the API endpoints are in the same code base, to the thing I skipped, the V2 of what if the get server-side props returns the data directly? So that was just a mess, and I stuck to like a V1++ of tRPC doing the bridge instead. But now this third generation of these solutions of what if the components could actually do the server-side stuff themselves and just pass the data down like properties? And when it clicked hard. It clicked so hard that I got called a fanboy, and specifically I got called a shill a lot, as though Vercel paid me to have these opinions. Despite the fact that when Vercel and I first inked our deal, which by the way, the numbers have not changed since we started, despite me being 5 times larger, I could reasonably charge them more, but I don't because I don't want to. I'm very happy with the current terms of our deal. Things are working out great for everyone involved. The magic of server components blew me the fuck away. And I went from unsure to one of the biggest advocates very quickly. Seemingly too quickly, because to this day, I still get shit that Vercel paid me to believe these things that I didn't believe in the past. But really what had happened was I used it in my perspective shift. And that's why I made this video. Because I honestly think if you guys knew my history of going from a disgruntled backend dev to a functional fanboy to the guy porting Twitch from Ember to TypeScript, all the way to where I am now, I think it makes a lot of sense why I feel the way I feel. None of this has anything to do with what I've been paid. I included those details because I think you guys should know them. But my perspective has not been influenced by the money that has been spent on my channel. I love Next because I went from not caring about Next to not liking most of Next to feeling like this is the framework of the future. And when I started using Next, it was barely even the framework of the past. It was such a mess. And what the team's created here is something truly groundbreaking that I actually really love. So yeah, let me know in the comments about how I'm clearly a paid shill, because that's what you guys love to do. Until next time, maybe you'll have some opportunities to go ship some Next. Anyways, peace nerds.